The University of Washington, that's in Seattle, looms large in the life of Douglas North. And in that regard, I'm delighted to welcome the reigning delegate from UW, Margaret Levi.
Thanks. Hard act to follow you, Jack. I feel like I'm at a table of surrogate siblings, and it's really not, and actually in a room full of surrogate siblings. But I'm one of the firstborn, because I was at the University of Washington in 1974. I arrived there as what Doug would call a young pup. I was a first-year assistant professor, and I'd heard of Doug North, and his reputation on the campus was that he was creative and imaginative and energetic, and not ever smart enough to win a Nobel Prize. He also had a reputation for being nasty, brutish, and short.
And only one of those things never changed.
So you can imagine my both delight and terror when I got a call from Doug North. This seems to be a story. And he said, "Hey, I hear you're a Marxist. Sam Bowles called me, told me I should talk to you. You're a Marxist, and I got to relearn my Marxism. When can we have lunch?" So we did have lunch and discovered that I wasn't as much of a Marxist as he thought, except he thought I dressed too well to be a Marxist. And that he wasn't as much of a brute as I feared. And so began a lifelong friendship. And I've learned an immense amount from Doug, as we all have. And I'm going to give you some specific things that I learned. The first thing I learned was about transaction cost theory, about which I knew virtually nothing. And frankly, no one else knew much then either in 1974. It was just sort of coming onto the table. And I took a seminar, sat in on a seminar that Doug was teaching with Steve Chung. And one of the things that I most remember from that was Steve Chung telling us that the smartest thing to do was to steal. That was what you should do, unless you were too young and couldn't get away with it. Well, where is Steve Chung now? I'll tell those who don't know the story another time. But I did learn a lot about transaction cost. Doug and I decided, partially because I was a Marxist and he a neoclassicist, that we would start a political economy program together at the University of Washington for undergraduates. Now, Doug was the chair of his department. This meant he got to teach a course with somebody else for free. I mean, it counted as one of his courses. I was a first-year assistant professor. This meant I got to teach an extra course. I wasn't in his department. And it paid off, at least in the long run. In the long run, it led to not only Structure and Change in Economic History. That was a book that Doug was working on then, and I like to think I helped him with it. It also produced A Rule in Revenue, the book that I dedicated to Doug. Jean's also dedicated a book to Doug, just to give you a sense of his influence. But it also led to my being one of the most unpopular people in political science for some time, actually. A comparative politics rat show. Bob Bates is shaking his head very strongly, and Adam Jaworski should be shaking his very. There were the three of us, and maybe Sam Popkin, who wasn't always a comparativist. And we were not liked. It was okay to do this in your area, Ken. You could do that in American politics. But in comparative politics, we were supposed to be in the field. We were supposed to do this in-depth case study work, which we all did. But we weren't supposed to use a theory like rational choice that might suggest there were actually comparisons to be made across countries, place, and time. I was persona non grata in my department for a while, as well as in parts of political science. So Doug gave me a lot. He also got me into a lot of trouble. And then he would get me out of it. Of Rule and Revenue got me out of a lot of trouble, and I thank him a lot for that and for the work that's been subsequent. When I became president of the American Political Science Association, it was Doug who immediately told me what I was supposed to write my presidential address on, which was a new theory of government, or towards a new theory of government. I won't claim I have a theory yet, but I certainly have been working on that. He also gave me a fabulous new network of friends. I met Bates through Doug, I met Jean through Doug, and of course, dear Elizabeth. Really one of my closest friends of all time. And he extended my analytic network. I mean, what Jack was saying about interdisciplinarity is absolutely true, and it's a lesson I think I've learned and taken to heart from Doug and from Lynn, another one of my important influences and mentors. Okay, Doug, however, is a very stubborn cuss. And there are things that I tried to teach him then, some of which he seems to have learned subsequently, but many of which he hasn't, and which I think he could still learn. And I know he's got many more years and books in him, so this is a chance to give him some lessons. Barry talked about some of the words Doug hates. In the 1970s, and possibly still, it was power. I'm a political scientist. I wasn't supposed to use the term power. I could use relative bargaining power. That was okay. He sort of knew what that was. He would concede that. And he's gotten a better sense of what political power might mean over time. But at that time, he really didn't. And I thank Barry and John for finally beating it into him a little bit. He wasn't really sure what made a government trustworthy, or if that was even a question that should be asked at that time. That's also changed, I think. And wasn't really totally attentive. He was attentive to rulers and to politicians. I didn't think that was quite fair, Bob. The maximizing ruler is clearly a politician. But he wasn't always aware of how citizens reacted to that. That wasn't part of the model at that time. Again, there's been some change in that regard. The final thing that he wouldn't accept, remember I was a Marxist, was a notion of exploitation. I had the sort of same reaction you did, Jim, to the feudal contract being good for the serfs. It sort of struck me as not quite right. In fact, egregious to even say something, suggest something like that. And I still try to work, as does Doug, I believe, on issues of how to promote social justice and use our theories to do that. I'm not sure I use the word exploitation anymore, but I'm still concerned about who's at the end of a supply chain and whether they're being paid fairly and being treated well. Okay, let me end by saying that I continue to find myself exploring the agenda that in those crucial years in the 1970s, when I basically wrote my second dissertation under Doug, my first was in a whole nother field, he helped me define my agenda. And that's an important contribution to my work, and I think in some ways to political science, because I've helped define with Bob, with Lynn, with Barry, with Ken, and the agenda in part for political science more generally. One of the key things is beliefs. The way I think about that is in terms of legitimating beliefs that can create a virtuous or vicious cycle of government that really brings to bear the relationship between the rulers and the citizens in a very different way than I was thinking about it in the 1970s. And some recent work that I've been doing using African data begins to go beyond what I've done on more sophisticated Western European and American data to think about those questions. The question of leadership, of politicians, of the ways in which leaders make a difference and can influence beliefs and ultimately behavior continues to be an abiding concern for me, and I think a continuing to be cutting edge area of political science. And finally, we've heard a lot about institutions, but also less, but still, about organizations. And NWW clearly deals with organizations, and I think that's quite an important move. But there's still a lot we need to know about organizational cultures, how they are created and sustained, and with what effect. Thanks.